Good morning and welcome to George Dungan, legislative candidate from District 26. Thank you, George, for joining us for our virtual legislative candidate meetings. My name is Gina Ragland, and joining me today are AARP lead advocacy volunteers, Joyce Beck, Danny DeLong, Mike Barwig, and Pat Etherton is also joining us as a volunteer, a member of AARP, and also a constituent of yours in District 26. Emily Wick is also joining us today to assist with some of the technical details for the program. As a reminder, this meeting is being recorded and will be shared with AARP members across your district prior to the election. George, we appreciate your taking the next 30 minutes of your time to meet and discuss issues of importance to the 50+ voter and their families in your district and across Nebraska. As a short background, AARP is the nation's largest nonprofit, nonpartisan organization dedicated to empowering and strengthening people 50 and older to choose how they live as they age. As people live longer, healthier lives, we know we need to think differently about what it means to age. With that, George, I'm going to throw it back to you to start off by giving us a little background about yourself and your campaign in roughly 5 minutes or less. And once we've completed your opening, we'll move into the questions. So George, I'm going to let you have the floor. Go ahead.
Well, thank you very much. And I like I said earlier, I appreciate you having me here. And I want to thank everybody for being a part of the Zoom call. I know it's time consuming to do these things, but I also know it's important. And I genuinely appreciate the opportunity to come here and talk about the issues that AARP care about and are important, not just to you as an organization, but to folks in my district here. Like Pat, you said, as a constituent of LD 26, and I've been out knocking doors for quite some time in the last year and a half. And I know that these issues are important to everybody. So I'm glad to talk about them here today. By way of a little bit of background, just to introduce myself. So as Gina indicated, my name is George Dungan. I'm running for state legislature in LD 26. That is Northeast Lincoln, currently represented by Senator Matt Hansen, who's term limited, and I'm running to step into those shoes and continue a lot of the good work that he was doing. Little history about myself. So I was born and raised here in Lincoln. I graduated from Southwest High School, which I tell people, don't hold that against me. I know it's a badge of my youth, but don't hold that against me too much. I did, excuse me, leave Lincoln for a little while. I went to undergraduate university down at the University of Kansas in Lawrence, where I double majored in political science and women gender studies. Graduated from college, and there's not much you can do with degrees in political science and women gender studies. And so I went to law school, as a lot of people do with those. And so went to law school actually out in Washington, D.C. I went to law school at American University out there. And upon graduating with my degree, quickly determined that DC was not the place I wanted to be. Three and a half years in Washington, DC was enough for me. And I was kind of sick of a lot of the stuff that was out there that I'm sure we're all sick of all the time, and decided to come back to Nebraska. When I moved back to Lincoln, I was given the really special opportunity to apply at the Public Defender's Office. And I'd been working at the Public Defender's Office for almost 9 years. Started in the juvenile unit, so working with kids and trying to represent kids as best I could in court, whose families couldn't afford attorneys. Worked through various other dockets there, working in misdemeanors. Currently, I work on the felony docket. But tomorrow is actually my last day at the Public Defender's Office. I'm leaving the PD's office, and I'm going to be essentially just focusing on campaigning full time. So one of the questions I get often, and I'll try to keep this as short as possible, is why are you running? That's one thing that a lot of folks ask when they want your background. The answer to that, if I were to sort of encapsulate it quickly, is that I wasn't really planning on running for office. I'm not somebody who's run for office before. I've always been sort of content to sort of work on the ground level, helping people. But I've really, as a lot of people have, I think, become pretty disenchanted with the amount of partisanship and the amount of fighting that's going on in our legislature here in Nebraska, and with a lot of the sort of radical hyper-partisanship we've been seeing. Like I said, DC was not my cup of tea. And I think that we're seeing more and more of that DC mentality here in Nebraska. And it's, I think, across the board, whether we're talking about folks on the right or folks on the left. I think there's too many people digging their heels in right now and not working together to get enough things done for everyday Nebraskans. And that frankly really bothered me. So there's a number of state senators that I think have worked really hard over the past few decades to come together on issues and get things done. That's very much the mold that I would like to fashion myself in. I consider myself a pragmatist who wants to come to some common sense solutions for real problems for real people. And that's kind of what got me excited to run, was I think we need more people like that. So it's kind of my broad bio. I could probably talk for a lot longer, but I'll throw it back to you if you have any specific questions.
Perfect. Thank you, George. And thank you for sharing your bio, sharing your interests, your background. We appreciate all that you do. And again, thank you for running for the legislature. We're going to jump right into the questions now. We provided you ahead of time with a set of 3 issues containing 4 questions that pertain to the 50 plus in Nebraska. Again, we're looking to allot 5 minutes for each of the questions just because of our time constraints. Our first question this morning is on health, caregiving, and home and community-based services. And Mike Barwig, one of our volunteers, is going to take that. So Mike, go ahead.
Good morning, George. And like Gina said, the first one is on health, caregiving, and home and community-based services. Home and community-based services, also known as HCBS, provides an array of services designed to assist individuals with activities of daily living that promotes independence to support them to age in place or delay institutional care. A family caregiver is any family member, friend, or acquaintance who cares for another person that is unable to live independently, often without pay. Telehealth services can be significant for older adults in rural areas or underserved communities, while also providing support to family caregivers by reducing travel, wait times, and costs associated with in-person care. So the first part of the question is, what will you do to support the 240,000 unpaid family caregivers in Nebraska through policies such as enhanced respite services, access to telehealth, caregiver education and training, and help with out-of-pocket costs? And the second part of the question is, what will you do to protect and or expand the home and community-based services, HCBS, program, particularly recruitment and retention of a sufficient workforce and adequate funding of the services that Nebraskans and their families rely on?
Yeah, and I first of all, I just want to say I really appreciate this question. When I was reading through these questions that were provided, one thing that popped out to me is sort of how this has personally affected my family. So my grandfather moved in with my mom and my stepdad for the last 3 years of his life, 2 years, maybe 3 years of his life. And so they were those unpaid caregivers that we're talking about here. And I had a really personal insight into not just the amount of effort they were able to put into that, but in sort of what that entire process looks like. I mean, when he first moved in, he was mobile, he was driving, he was able to do all of the things where he didn't need as much care. And then you got to see the entire spectrum of that sort of unpaid assistance that they provided him as he started to go downhill over the years, and then ultimately did pass away with home hospice care in the house. So I had sort of a perfect view as to what that looks like. And I guess to me, the answer to that first question is it's sort of 2 parts. One is you have to have acknowledgement, and then 2, you have to have funding. I think the fact that we're even talking about this is important, but we need to make sure that on a statewide level, there's an appreciation and an acknowledgement for that unpaid care. It's one of those things that I think sometimes kind of goes by the wayside, or people don't acknowledge it. And you can't really address a problem or make things easier or better for folks unless you're talking about that. So, one thing I very much would intend to do at the statewide level is make sure that we address this problem by acknowledging that it exists, and acknowledging the not just financial, but also the physical and the emotional burdens that I think goes on to folks who really do provide that amazing sort of unpaid service at home. It's a real weight that a lot of people do willingly because they love these folks. And I think that's an incredible gift they give people, but we have to acknowledge it. And then 2 is funding. The answer to a lot of these questions, and I hope I don't sound like a broken record, is making sure that we have proper funding provided for those services. Specifically talking about access to telehealth and education and training, making sure that we have people who are able to take care of their loved ones or family members or acquaintances in an appropriate manner means you have to be able to train them. And we see that, I think, really clearly in the rural-urban divide. You look out in the urban areas and versus the rural areas, and there's just difference in the amount of services that are provided. And so access to that telehealth is going to be important, and making sure that we properly fund things like broadband, making sure people have access to those services digitally. That's going to be vital in making sure we expand that. And then to the last point, real quick here, with regards to recruitment and retention, we see a lot of services that people provide student loan forgiveness or other financial incentive in other fields if they go and work in more rural areas or in certain just fields in general, like public service loan forgiveness, for example, for public defenders. You can have your law student loans paid off if you go into public service. I'd be very interested in seeing what kind of financial incentives could be done at the state level to incentivize that retention and recruitment specifically for this kind of care that needs to be given, because it is crucial, but we need to make sure people are being paid for it when they give back that care to the family.
Very good. Thank you.
Thanks, George, for answering that. My condolences on your grandfather. And I also want to just take just a short minute to thank you for understanding caregivers, the unpaid family caregivers, because most generally people in society don't understand unless you've been there, done that. So appreciate your thoughts and comments on that. Our second question now will shift us more into a facility type setting, nursing facility quality. And so Joyce Beck is going to take that. So go ahead, Joyce.
Good morning, George, and thank you so much for your time. Over 20,000 Nebraskans require care in nursing facilities or assisted living communities. Facilities have closed their doors, citing reimbursement challenges and staffing shortages. Nebraska will need an additional 4,700 more nursing assistants, LPNs, and RNs by 2028 to meet Nebraska's care needs. Everyone, regardless of where they reside, deserves to be treated with dignity and with respect, to have access to quality medical care. Better staff to resident ratios improve the overall quality of care and the well-being of residents. Workforce recruitment, retention, and job satisfaction challenges are prevalent across the long-term services and the support industry. Causes of workforce challenges must be identified and implemented to respond to the growing need for high quality care. So, George, my question is this: what will you do to improve the quality of nursing facility care for Nebraska residents, including addressing the growing long-term care workforce crisis in the state, professional education and training, and accountable facility reimbursement?
So similar to the last one, I actually also have a personal connection to this. My grandma from the other side of my family resided at the Landing here in Lincoln for about 20 years. She was one of the first residents to move in when it was first built. And again, similar to what we talked about in the last question, she went through the entire spectrum of care there. When she first moved in, she was doing the independent living in the apartment where there was literally no assistance, and she had a busier social calendar than I did with events there. And then throughout her time there, in about the 20 years she stayed there, she worked through more assisted living, and then ultimately was in sort of their Alzheimer unit at the end, and then ultimately passed away there as well too. So she had incredible care. And when you look at the Landing, I mean, obviously it's very expensive, but it's really the gold standard, in my opinion, of what a lot of these care facilities could look like, or things like that. And one thing that I think is incredibly important, to your point, is that we make sure everybody has access to care like that, regardless of who you are, what your income level is, and certainly I think where your geographic location is. I have friends who have had to move grandparents from one city where they've resided to another because they don't have access to facilities that are either high quality or open or have beds available. Similar to the last question, and again, I don't want to sound like a broken record, but funding is vital. Reimbursement rates, which you mentioned, I think have to go up. I also serve on the board of the Bridge Behavioral Health, and so I'm familiar with working with Medicaid, Medicare with regards to reimbursement rates. And I'm well aware that reimbursement rates for certain facilities are too low. And I think we also have to focus on creating more workforce recruitment for people who are going to go work in those facilities. Another thing I think we have to do is we have to make sure that we create an environment that is incentivizing the growth and development of facilities like this, right? Facilities have to be built for them to exist. And we have to make sure that we're creating incentives to build facilities like this in areas where they don't otherwise exist, to make sure that people don't have to leave the houses, or rather the cities they grew up in, just to find care that's quality. And so I think we need to make sure we're creating new facilities. We need to make sure we're supporting the ones that currently exist financially. And we need to make sure that there's access to those facilities for everybody, which I genuinely think comes down to making sure those people have proper funding and the ability to go to some assisted living if they need to, regardless of their income level. So it's a multifaceted solution, but I do think it's important. And I've seen firsthand the quality of care that somebody can get and the importance of making sure that they have a good place to go.
Well, thank you, George, for your excellent answer and your understanding of the situation.
Okay. Thank you, George. Our final question for discussion today centers around livable communities and helping people stay in their home. And so Danny DeLong is going to take that. Go ahead, Danny.
Good morning, George. Glad you're with us. AARP has a longstanding policy of supporting initiatives that help people age in place. We do that because fully 75% of the people who are 50 and older say that that's their priority as they grow older, is to age in place. Normally what they're thinking about, well, let's go at it differently. Aging in place to us means that we need to focus our efforts on creating livable communities. Livable communities have certain qualities about them that make them livable. One of them is safe and secure. Communities need to provide adequate safety and security infrastructure. A second one is that community offers affordable housing so that people can move into different types of homes. For example, people who live in 5-bedroom homes and need to downsize to a 2-bedroom home. Well, they need to be able to downsize to an affordable 2-bedroom home. The livable communities need to have a great transportation infrastructure so that individuals can travel by multiple means. And finally, we want livable communities to have supportive community services, two of which are great healthcare, accessible healthcare, and internet, broadband internet, high-speed internet. So that's what we're looking for. That's what we're thinking about as we support actions that will create more livable communities in Nebraska. Affordable transit options are critical because people need to be able to, especially in rural areas, because people need to be able to access healthcare. Maybe they live in a community which no longer even has a hospital or a doctor's clinic or physical therapy or anything like that. So they need to be able to get to those services. High-speed internet, which you've spoken about a couple of times here, should have three possibilities for people. They should be affordable, reliable, and accessible for all Nebraskans. We want that. As a part of high-speed broadband, we also encourage the development of digital skills, also called digital literacy, which we think is also essential to obtaining the benefits of high-speed internet access in the home. My question then is, what will you do to ensure all Nebraskans, mainly those 50 plus, have access to livable communities which offer affordable housing, diverse transportation options, adequate health care, and affordable, reliable, and accessible high-speed internet, including digital skills development.
Well, I wish that I had another 35 minutes to talk about all of those things.
So do we.
It's all incredibly important. And, one thing that struck me as I was reading through this question, and especially as you explain it to me, is all of the things we're talking about here, while they do absolutely benefit people who are 50 and plus in age, right? They benefit everyone. And if you create a community that actually has access to affordable housing, digital opportunities, affordable transportation, what you're doing is you're creating a community that actually lifts up everybody. And so these are policies that I think, if we support these, which I absolutely do, and I'll go into a little more detail here briefly, but if you support them, it's one of those things that sort of is a rising tide that lifts all boats. And so that's what I find so exciting about a lot of these opportunities is they're things that everybody can get on board for, and they benefit everyone. A good example of that is my fiance works in the developmental disabilities community. And so a lot of the people she works with have physical disabilities who are wheelchair bound, or maybe they're nonverbal. But having access to high-speed broadband permits them to interact in communities in a way they wouldn't otherwise. Having housing that's built with accessibility, like physical accessibility in mind, benefits those individuals as well. And so, these are things that are near and dear to my heart as well. And that's why I take them so seriously. One thing that I've looked into quite a bit here, and what I've been trying to focus on a lot in my both campaign and talking to folks at the doors, but also in groups that I meet with, is affordable housing. Affordable housing is incredibly important to LD26 in particular. But there's been a number of folks that I've spoken to at the doors who've discussed with me the need to downsize and the difficulty, especially in our current housing market, finding affordable apartments or condominiums that need to be built. I think that's a solution, or the solution to that is going to be sort of, again, multifaceted. A lot of it's at the city level, but some of it's at the state level too. I think one of the big things we have to do is get all the stakeholders to the table together, including housing development individuals and companies that are going to be making these houses, and find ways to provide economic incentive for them to create affordable housing units. And whether we're talking about things like community land trusts in order to ensure that individual units stay at a certain price, or we're talking about a certain percentage of condos that get built in a unit have to be under a certain price and they receive incentive for building it that way. Whatever we do, I think we have to make sure that we're keeping affordable housing in mind. And I think another facet of that is going to be inclusive zoning and making sure that at the city level, we actually can have neighborhoods zoned that permit for that kind of affordable housing, smaller, not 8 stories tall, but a couple of stories, so it's more accessible for individuals who may not be able to go to the 8th story as easily, and finding ways to keep that in mind. High-speed internet, I have talked about it a lot. It's one thing that's very important to me. I think public-private partnerships and finding ways, again, to incentivize private companies to go out into rural areas and install that broadband is vital. But then, like you said, we have to make sure people know how to use that broadband and have that digital literacy. I would like to see programs, whether it's at local high schools or community colleges, that are essentially subsidized, because I think those should be free access to individuals who are 50 plus to come in and say, hey, I've used computers all my life, but I'm not as familiar with how this works or that works. Can I have a quick 2-week program on how to use this program, whether it's Photoshop or just the internet or any of those things, to make sure we're providing digital literacy. And then finally, transportation options. You mentioned that. Very, very important we work on that. I think here in Lincoln or in any of the more urban areas, we can continue to work on affordable, if not free, access to the bus system. During the pandemic, they made the buses free, and frankly, it worked really well for a number of people. And so trying to keep bus systems affordable for folks who may have be on a set income is going to be really important. But then also trying to find, again, public-private partnerships with companies like Uber or Lyft or other kind of rideshare opportunities for the more rural areas where buses don't necessarily exist in the same way. That's going to be important too. So, there's no silver bullet solution to all of this, but one thing I can promise, you and anybody else watching this, is all of the things that are being talked about in this sort of community based question are very, very important to me. And things that affect people who are 50 plus, they affect people in the developmental disabilities community, they affect everybody. And so you have a commitment for me to work on these issues to make sure we have accessible housing, affordable housing, and make sure that everybody can benefit from a lot of the digital advancements that we're trying to put into Nebraska. So it's definitely important to me.
Thank you. We appreciate your response, Mr. Dungan.
Thank you, George. As we come to the end of our meeting, I'd like to offer now to you the final minutes for any closing thoughts, comments you might have for our members, and of course, the constituents of your district. So we have about roughly 3 minutes left. If you have any final comments, go ahead and go ahead and do that at this point in time.
Yeah, well, like I said, I just really appreciate the opportunity to be here. This is fun for me. I like talking to groups who have actual policy-based questions, because what we're doing here is we're talking about the issues, and I think that's important. Like I said, my commitment to the district and to the state is that I'm not going to get bogged down in hyper-partisan politics. And the reason I'm doing this is I want to actually reach common sense solutions to problems that affect everybody. I promise that I'll always work hard to come to these solutions. I'm not always going to have the answers, and I'll always admit readily when I don't know something. But at the end of the day, I'm willing to work with people from all across the spectrum politically and from all individual groups to come up with those answers, because it benefits everybody. If you have any questions about issues or you want to know more about me, you can go to georgefornebraska.com. All one word, all spelled out, georgefornebraska.com. We have contact information and some more information about the campaign on there. But otherwise, I'm just really looking forward to continuing to work with you all and coming to some real answers for a lot of the problems we've talked about here, because I know we need to, and I think for too long we haven't gotten stuff done. So I'm willing and ready to work with you.
Perfect. Thank you, George, again, for taking the time to visit with us. We wish you the best with your campaign. And as I said, thank you for meeting with AARP today. Take care.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Have a great day.
You
Yep,
too.
you too.